Hi, let's talk about how we can use the animation system in our walking agents. So at the very basics of it, we can set our Navmesh agents to have an animation. So I'm over here in EZPZ Toolkit number 15, and we are looking at this moving character in here. And this guy is set up using your Navmesh agent, using the Navmesh Walk Towards script, but it also has a animation component. So if you look at the graphics section over here, we click on this, we can see that this animation component is being controlled by this animator here. And this is what it looks like. If I were to pick up this stick, this dog will come towards me, and then we can also have a look at how this affects the animation system. So we go pick it up, it starts walking like this, so cute. And then it stops. So you might have noticed that currently the animation is sitting at doggo sit, and as soon as we make it move, we can see that the transition between the doggo sit to doggo walk goes up, and then you might have also noticed that the speed is being changed here. So that's essentially what's happening. So if I were to throw the stick over here, the dog moves, its speed gets updated, and the animation is being controlled by the value of the speed, or it depends on the value of the speed. So you might ask, how is the speed getting updated? Well, it's getting updated through this connection over here. So if you look at the graphic settings here, we can see that the Doggo Graphics Animator is being sent a speed value using this speed string over here. So just a warning, I'm about to get into the code. So if you're not worried about code, maybe don't worry about this bit too much. But the way that works is we are accessing the Navmesh agent, and then the Navmesh agent has this property called velocity, and we're essentially just getting the magnitude of that velocity. And this velocity is just a three-dimensional vector that tells us the direction that it's going and how fast it is. So then this magnitude then gets passed on to the animator using the setFloat function, and that's essentially how it works. So this is what's called an animation state machine. This was done manually just using the primitives that the dog is made of. So if we go over to the dog and the doggo graphics, we can see that it is just made up of a bunch of Unity primitives. I'll just show you the raw animations by going to animation and then animation again. And then we can see the dope sheet for this particular hierarchy. And then we can preview the walking animation. And then we can also preview the sitting animation. So this was done manually, and it's quite involved. If you want a video about doing it that way, please let me know. But there is an easier way of doing this, and I'm going to demonstrate that by replacing the graphics on these dummies over here with something fancier in a really handy Adobe service called Mixamo. So you can get a Mixamo account by just going to this address, and it is free. And the cool thing about this is you can get a whole bunch of animations as well as characters, but we're just going to do some walking characters. So we just say walk in the search bar, and we see a whole bunch of fancy schmancy walking, and then there's just regular walking, and then there's this really fancy schmancy walking here. I think what we'll do is we'll just choose this animation over here, and then we can see that the animation includes the position delta. So what we can do is we can just get rid of the position animation and say in place. And then now it's just going to be walking like that in place. And the cool thing is we can download this whole animation, including the model, straight into our Unity project. So if we just say download, let's change the download from FBX binary to FBX for Unity. Let's include the skin. Don't worry about keyframe reduction, and then let's go ahead and download. And let's just download this to a place that's easy for us to find. In this case, I'm literally going to go into a folder called Easy to Find, and I'm just going to save it there. And then what we can do is we can go to this location and then drag this FBX into our pre-existing project. So if we were to go over to here, and I'm just going to say my project folder, it doesn't matter where it is. And then I'm going to go here and then drag it over to here. So this isn't quite ready to go. We need to do a bit of setup. And what we're going to do to set that up is we're just going to drag that into our scene over here. And we can see that it's already been pre-configured with materials. If we have a look at this, we can preview a bunch of things inside the inspector. So note that I am previewing the asset, not the object within the hierarchy yet. So if we just go into animation, we can see that it has a walking animation, and then that's what it looks like. Now, what do we need to do to put this animation into the game view? Well, we need to expand this asset over here, and then we can see that there is this animation asset. We can tell it's an animation because as soon as we click into it, we can see this preview. But also, this is the icon for animation. It's made up of this triangle, which means delta to me, which basically means change. And you can see these little squiggly lines that also mean change. So what we can do is we can drag this animation into the root level of this object here, which is what it's going to recognize. And then as we do that, we can see that the inspector over here has automatically added this animator object. And then you can see that we've also created this controller asset for this particular object. The next thing you'll notice is when this object is highlighted, we can see that the animator window also has this state machine for this animation. So we're not quite done yet, but when we press play, we can see that that animation just ran for one cycle. It didn't loop like we saw it in Mixamo. What we can do to fix that is we're going to need to go inside the FBX asset, go into animation, and make sure that this loop time tick box is activated. Now, you might find that when you open this, this option is locked. So what you need to do is you just need to find a button that says Edit Animation, and that's going to unlock it. So it might look a little bit like this if you go into walking and then maybe you just say edit, and then that will allow you to edit. So when you edit these things and then you click out of this, it'll ask you to save the changes, and you just go ahead and save. I'm just going to put the loop time back in there again, and I'm going to save. Now that this has the loop time activated, when we press play, we should be able to see it run or walk continuously. So now that's in a loop. So we're almost there. So what we can do now is we can replace the graphics of one of these dudes with this guy. So let's just go ahead and maybe pick on this dude moving outside. And then this is just a graphical object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to deactivate this graphics bit and then put this as a child, and let's go ahead and center it. Just go into the transform and then say reset to center it that way. So now everything's 0, 0, 0. Let's just see how that looks. Let's go ahead and zoom out and press play. Now that guy's kind of walking. But it's still not quite done yet because it's just going to continuously walk. And we also noticed that it just went through the door there without opening it. So let's fix the door opening thing. We need to add some kind of collision mechanism for this. So we'll notice that the stand-in dummy at least had the character controller. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and copy this component from the original one and then paste it over here. Not there, just to paste component as new. And that's a little bit low, so maybe we'll just move that up a little bit like that. So this still isn't quite right, but at least it's going to end up opening that door over there. Let's just have a look. Open Mr. Door, let's zoom in. And now our only problem is it keeps walking even though it's stopped. So we can solve this pretty easily, but it involves editing the animator. So what I'm thinking is let's just have no animation to begin with, so it doesn't actually walk. until such time that the object is moving. So what we can do is we can add a new state in here. So say create state, and let's just say create empty. And then let's make this the default state. So if we just go ahead and right click here and then say set as layer default. Let's just call this standing still. And this is allowed. We have no animation in here. So what happens is when we start the simulation, the animation is just going to be this, and it's never going to go into this. Now this is going to look a little bit weird because that beginning pose is not quite right. We'll fix that later. But now we have at least a way for us not to be walking. So what do we need to do now? Well, we're going to go and take a page from the movable doggo. So remember, the movable doggo had a state machine that had this setup. So basically what happens is the default is the non-walking animation. In this case, it does have an animation. And then it uses this speed mechanism to move to the walk. So it has this thing called a transition. So basically what this means is if the speed value, which is this, is greater than 0 basically, we move on to the walking animation. So we can take that same idea, go back to this state machine here. We can add a float parameter. Let's call this one speed, but this can be anything that we want. But since we're talking about speed, we might as well make it speed. And then what we can do is we can make a new transition. So we right click here and say make transition, drag it to the destination transition, and then we can set the condition here. So we just go ahead and say plus, and then we can see that it's already added speed. Because it's the only parameter in here, it automatically added speed. And then we can change the conditions, but in this case we actually want it to be greater than just 0 basically. So let's put in like any number that's bigger than 0. We're still not quite there yet though. I'm just going to click over here so we're actually looking at the right thing. So we can manually control this now. If we just pressed play and then went back to the animator and then set this speed value to 1, we can see that our little guy, our little animation, has transitioned from not walking to walking. Now we need a way for it to go back to not walking. So let's just go ahead and do that. Just for convenience's sake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this guy back out here so it's closer to its destination so we don't have to wait so long. And now we need a way for it to go back from walking to standing still. So we just use the same idea. Let's make a transition from the walking animation back to standing still. And this transition now is going to have a different condition, but the condition is going to be speed less than whatever that value that we put in the other side, which is that guy and that guy, 0.1. Now keep in mind we're only controlling this manually, so we're only doing stuff with this state machine. So the idea is eventually we'll have a script edit this value automatically for us, but we're only setting up the state machine right now, so let's do it this way. So if we just turn this speed into 1, we can see that the transition happens to the walking animation. And then if we set this to 0, we can see that it stops. It doesn't quite start and stop as quickly as I'd like. So what we can do is we can get rid of this thing called has exit time. And basically this is like the transition between the previous animation and the next one. You can see there's some blending happening. But if we untick the has exit time, it should just transition immediately. Okay, I'm liking that better. So how do we get this to do it automatically? If we remember, we can link to the animation using the graphics settings. So what we can do is just grab the object that has our animator, and this is this guy here, the animator component. And then we also need to note the name of the speed string, and it just so happens to be the speed string here. But just to show you that it can be anything that we want, we could potentially just say anything, Obviously, this is not a good name for it, but I just want to show you that this can, in fact, be anything. Pun intended totally. But if we just go back to the code here again, warning for the code people who don't like code, what is happening in this script is that we have the animator object, or the animator component. What we're doing is we're taking the velocity of the Navmesh agent and then putting it into a float value called speed by just taking the magnitude of this vector 3 here. And then because we have the name of the speed string, what we do is we just talk to the animator and then we literally just say set this float value to the speed of the Navmesh agent. And then we can see this working. I'm just going to move the moving character a little bit further away so we can see the transition, and then have a look at what happens to this value here. This is going to increase in value when the agent is moving, and then when it stops, it's going to end up becoming 0, and then we also end up stopping the animation. All right, let's press play. Let's look at the animation to see it's walking, and then it stops. Oh, by the way, see this blue arrow here? That is the velocity vector. And the length of this vector is just the speed. And that's what we get when we say dot magnitude to a vector. Okay, so this stepping or this idle state doesn't look quite right to me because no one stands like that. So how can we fix this? Well, we can go back to Mixamo and then we can find an idle animation. So let's go back to Mixamo and let's look for an idle animation. Let's actually search for idle. And I think this one's probably not too bad. So you can see it's breathing a little bit. So we can actually take this animation and put it into our model. So let's just go ahead and download this. FBX, not binary, but FBX for Unity. Let's keep the skin 30 frames a second and no keyframe reduction. Let's just go ahead and download. So now we need to put this into a location that it's easy to find for us. And then for me, I'm just going to put this in a place literally called easy to find in my C drive. And then let's go ahead and put this in our Unity project. So let's go back to Unity. Let's go to our My Project folder. Let's go ahead and find that idle animation and then drag it into our project. And then now we have idle. Let's inspect it a little bit. You can press play and the idle animation is here. Now you can see that this is actually its own complete different model. We didn't necessarily have to download the model again. And the way to do that is if we just go back to Mixamo and then say download, we can just say without skin and then download again. And then let's just call this no skin. And then we can see that our file is half as big because it doesn't have the skin. And if we just go ahead and import that, we don't get the preview. That's just kind of annoying. But what we can do is we can just drag any of the models that's viable into this, and then we can see a preview. They were done using the Mixamo animation rig. So the result of that is we can actually just take these animations here and then drag it into our pre-existing animator. So if we just said and then drag, we can see that we have this animation here. Now we don't necessarily want to do that if we're lazy. The other thing we could do is we already have this set up here. We can see that this state actually has no animation. So what we can do is we can just drag the idle animation into here and then we're done. So now we have an idle animation. So it's not really standing still. Let's just call it idle because it's not standing completely still. And then we have these transitions already set up. Let's see how that's working. So it's walking, 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 and then when we stop, we're idle. So I think we might still have an issue here. I think this idle animation doesn't loop. So let's have a look and wait till it gets to the end. Yeah, it doesn't loop. But we know how to fix that. Ooh, door opened. Oh, hello, Mr. We know how to change the non-looping idle animation. We just need to go to the idle no skin. This is the one we're using. Just go ahead and edit this, and then let's add a loop time. All right, let's try it again. Oh, we need to save it. And then walking. We get to our destination. We're idle now, so you can see that it's doing the idle animation. It's breathing slightly. And then we loop. We're pretty much done with this. And hello, Mr. Guy. Let's just do a little bit of cleanup. So this probably shouldn't be anything. Let's put it back to speed. And then we need to go back to the other setting and then just change this to speed. And then we're done. We now have some Mixamo characters with nice walking animations. So the next question for this is, do we actually need to use this model? And the answer is no, we can use any model from Mixamo. In fact, we can use our own models if we just uploaded our characters. So I think what you need to do is you just need to set it up with a T-pose, but that's going to be beyond the scope of this video. So one thing to be careful about downloading these models from Mixamo is some of them can be quite big. So earlier I downloaded these two characters here, and then you can see that they're like 100 meg. So we don't necessarily want that, especially for a smaller project. But something like the boss is more reasonable because I think it's around about 7 meg. So what we need to do is just same thing with this, FBX for Unity, 30 frames a second with skin and no keyframe reduction. If we wanted to reduce that file size even more, we can look for a very short animation. We're not necessarily going to use this, but it's just a short one. Maybe golf putt would be less threatening. 58. Just looking at the frames, I think this was the shortest one. Yeah, let's do the 26 frames one, and then let's go ahead and download this. It's still with skin, 30 frames per second animation, Unity FBX. Go download this guy. Let's put it in easy to find. And look, it's a 6 megabyte asset. That's what we want. I mean, we could probably make it even smaller, but this is just a bit of a hacky, quick thing. You get the idea. Let's go import this into our project. And then now that we have our boss inside our project folder, we can just go ahead and attach it to our character like this, and maybe like this. That's not going to do us very well, so what we need to do is we need to reset that to 0, 0, 0. So let's just go ahead to the transform, say reset. Now you can see it's overlaid on top of the original model. You might have also noticed that it doesn't have the textures. We'll fix that later. We just need to attach the animations for now. The way to do that is we'll just take the original animator component here. Let's just go ahead and say copy this component. Let us paste this as a new component character. This is okay because this Xbox controller is compatible with the skeleton that this boss has. We just need to disable this dude over here, and then we need to update the graphics animator from the Navmesh script, but everything else is the same. And then if we just press play, we can see that these animations are behaving as expected. So if we just move him back a little bit. Now I think that's really cool. Okay, let's do one final thing. Let's just get the textures back onto this guy. So what we can do is we can just go ahead and look into the FBX here. And there's a whole bunch of tabs in the FBX. What we need to do is go into materials. And we have these two buttons, extract textures and extract materials. So we just need to go ahead and click these. Let's just put this into an appropriate folder. I guess let's just call this boss assets. Select that folder. And then we get this message about normal maps needing to be fixed. So let's just go ahead and say fix now. And look, we have a viable thingy. And if we just press play again, go back into Animator. Yep. So that's how you do animations using Mixamo in Unity. It's been a pretty long video. Let's end it there. Thanks for watching.